The morning she lost everything, the sky had the nerve to be beautiful. Pink and gold stretched across the Ashfern Valley like something painted by a hand that didn't know what was happening below it. Mora stood in the doorway of the only home she had ever known and watched the colors bleed across the horizon, while her father's hands shook against her shoulders. He had woken her before the birds, before Sarah, before the youngest ones could stumble down the stairs and ask questions that Aldrich Ashfield did not have the spine to answer. He had touched her arm in the dark of her small room beneath the eaves and whispered her name like it was something fragile, and Mora had known, not the details, not the shape of what was coming, but the weight of it. She had felt it settling over the house for months, like damp in old wood, warping everything slowly until nothing quite closed the way it should. She had packed in the dark. It did not take long. A cracked leather satchel that had been her mother's, a change of clothes, a comb with 3 missing teeth, a small jar of the salve her mother used to make for her skin when the winters turned brutal and her knuckles split along the ridges where the bone sat closer to the surface than it did on human hands. Aldrich walked her to the door. His hand found hers and pressed something into her palm. Metal. Warm from his grip. 5 gold coins. She looked down at them, then up at him. He was a small man, her father. She had outgrown him at 14, and by 18 she stood nearly a full head above him, broad through the shoulders and thick through the arms in the way her mother's people were built. His face was soft and lined and his eyes were wet, and he could not hold her gaze for longer than a breath before something in him buckled. "Your mother," he started, stopped, swallowed. "Your mother would be proud of you, Mora. You are brave and you are strong and you will find your way." The words sounded rehearsed. She wondered how many times he had practiced them in the dark, lying beside Sarah, staring at the ceiling, and telling himself this was mercy. She wanted to scream at him. She wanted to fold herself small enough to fit back into the girl he could still love without consequence. She wanted to ask him if the Merchants' Guild and the whispers and the slow bleeding of customers from his shop were really worth more than 11 years of braiding her hair around her tusks on market days, of telling the village boys to leave her be, of letting out the seams on her dresses without complaint, because she kept growing and could not stop. But Mora had her mother's jaw. Not just the shape of it, heavy and squared with the small sharp tusks pressing up from the lower lip, but the stubbornness that lived inside it. The ability to lock it shut when the alternative was breaking. So she said nothing. Aldrich kissed her forehead. He smelled like wool and the cheap tallow soap Sarah bought in bulk from the chandler. His lips trembled against her skin. Then he stepped back and closed the door. Mora stood on the step for a long time. She heard the latch slide home. She heard his footsteps move away, uneven and halting, and then the creak of the stairs as he climbed back up to the bed he shared with a woman who was not her mother and a life that no longer had room for what her mother had left behind. The coins were still in her fist. 5 gold, the price of a daughter. The sum total of what she was worth to the only person who had ever been obligated to love her. She did not cry. She turned south toward the road, and she walked. The sky was still beautiful. She did not forgive it for that. She walked because standing still felt like agreeing with what had been done to her. The road out of Millhaven was packed dirt gone to ruts. The kind of road that carts had chewed up in spring and summer had baked into hard ridges that caught at her boots. Mora kept her head down for the first mile, not out of grief, out of habit. You learned, when you were the only girl in a village with tusks and shoulders like a stonemason's apprentice, that looking down meant fewer conversations, fewer thrown stones, fewer of those long sliding looks that started at her jaw and ended somewhere around the word monster. The coins were in her left hand. She had not opened her fist since the door closed. 5 gold. She knew what 5 gold meant. It meant her father had been saving. It meant he had planned this, not for days, but for weeks, maybe longer, tucking coins into whatever hidden place a tailor keeps his quiet treasons. 5 gold was enough to matter and not enough to survive on, and the precision of that amount made her chest feel like something had been built wrong inside it. She did not cry on the first day. On the first night, she slept beneath an ash tree at the edge of a barley field, her satchel under her head and her fist still closed around the coins. The metal had gone warm and slick against her palm. She could feel the pressed faces on them. Some old king whose name she had never learned. And she thought about how strange it was that a dead man's profile was supposed to represent worth. That 5 of his small golden faces were supposed to equal one girl's life up to now. She ate the bread she had taken from the kitchen before dawn. It was half a loaf, brown and dense, the kind her father baked on Sundays because her mother had once told him that orc bread should be heavy enough to survive a journey. He'd kept baking it that way for 11 years after her death. Mora thought about that while she chewed and still did not cry. The second day brought rain. It came in from the west, from the direction of the Greymore Highlands, and it smelled of peat and iron and something older than either. Mora had no cloak. She walked through it with her shoulders hunched and her jaw set, and the rain running down the back of her neck into her collar where it pooled and chilled and stayed. By midday her boots were soaked through. By afternoon her feet had begun to blister. She passed through a village whose name she never learned. A woman at a fence line watched her go by and pulled her child closer. A man outside a farrier's shop spat into the mud. Not at her, near her, close enough to mean something. She bought dried meat and a bruised apple at a crossroads stall, and the merchant counted her coin twice and checked it with his teeth, and still looked at her like she had stolen it. 3 copper spent. She did the arithmetic in her head, converting, subdividing, portioning out a future in small sums. 5 gold was 200 copper. The meat and apple had cost 3. She could survive on 5 copper a day if she was careful, if she found water that was free, if nothing went wrong. 40 days. She had 40 days of life in her hand. On the second night she found a cattle shelter, empty and reeking of old dung, and she slept in the corner of it, with her knees drawn up and her fists still closed. The coins had begun to leave marks on her palm. 5 small circles pressed into the meat of her hand like brands. She opened her fingers once in the dark, just to feel the air against the raw skin, and then she closed them again. 40 days. She would need to find something before then. A place, a purpose, a door that did not close. Mora pulled her knees tighter and listened to the rain and did not cry. Not yet. The smell found her before the village did. Copper and wet stone, and something green underneath it all. Something alive in the way that only untended things are alive. Mora stopped walking and breathed it in. 3 days of road dust and stolen sleep had dulled her senses to everything except the next step, the next mile, the next place that wasn't the last one. But this smell cut through. It was sharp and honest, and it didn't care whether she belonged here. Thornwick sat in a shallow dip between 2 hills, like something that had rolled there and never bothered to climb out. She counted the buildings as she came down the slope. 11. Most of them timber and daub with roofs that had been patched so many times they looked quilted. Smoke rose from 4 chimneys. A goat stood in the middle of the road, chewing something it had no business chewing, and regarded her with the flat indifference that only goats and very old women could manage. Nobody came out to greet her. Nobody came out to chase her off. She wasn't sure which she had expected, but the absence of both left her standing at the edge of the village, with her satchel strap cutting into her shoulder, and no idea what to do with her feet. She walked in anyway. The road was packed, dirt gone to mud in patches where the morning dew hadn't burned off yet. To her left, a smithy with its doors open and its forge cold. A man sat on a stool outside it, sharpening a blade against a whetstone, and she saw that his left sleeve was pinned up at the elbow, the arm ending where it shouldn't. He looked up at her, looked at her tusks, her jaw, the breadth of her shoulders. Then he looked back down at his blade and kept sharpening. That was it. No narrowing of the eyes, no hand drifting toward a weapon. Just acknowledgement and dismissal in the same glance, like she was weather passing through. She kept walking. The well sat at the center of the village, ringed by stones that had been set with care a long time ago and neglected with equal commitment since. The water inside caught the light wrong, a faint reddish tint that explained the copper smell. A bucket hung from the crossbeam on a rope that looked like it was held together by stubbornness alone. Past the well, past a henhouse with more holes than walls, past a garden that someone was fighting a losing war against bindweed to maintain. The road narrowed and bent slightly to the right. And there, at the end of it, she saw the house. It was not a good house. She wanted to be clear with herself about that because something in her chest had lurched at the sight of it, and she did not trust that lurch. The walls were stone up to waist height and timber above, and the timber had gone silver grey with age and warped enough that the whole structure leaned to the left, like a drunk trying to remember which direction was home. Blackthorn vines had taken the eastern wall entirely, crawling up and over the roofline in a slow green conquest that must have been years in the making. One window shutter hung from a single hinge. The other was gone. But the roof, she noticed, the roof was slate, cracked in places, missing in others, but slate. Somebody had built this house to last, and the house had taken that intention and done its stubborn best to honor it, despite everything. The gate was chest height and made of iron that had gone to rust. A sign hung from it on a piece of wire. For sale, 5 gold, no returns. Mora read it twice. She read it a third time because the words didn't change, and she needed to be sure they wouldn't. Her hand went to the pouch at her belt. 5 coins. The exact number her father had pressed into her palm in the dark. The exact number that was supposed to mean goodbye. She stood at that gate for a long time, and the house leaned toward her like it had been waiting. The house looked like it had tried to die and failed. Mora stood at the gate with her hand on the latch, which was not so much a latch as a piece of twisted wire holding 2 rotting planks in a relationship neither seemed committed to. The blackthorn vines had done their work thoroughly. They crawled up the walls and across the roof and into the gaps where shutters had once hung, threading through the bones of the place like dark veins through a limb gone cold. The sign was still there, nailed to the gatepost with a single iron tack that had rusted into a permanent brown tear down the wood. For sale, 5 gold, no returns. She read it 3 times, not because the words were difficult, but because the number was exact. 5 gold, the precise weight she had carried in her fist for 3 days, the precise sum her father had decided she was worth. And here it was again, asking to be spent on a thing that leaned. The house leaned to the left, not dramatically, not in the way of buildings about to collapse. It leaned the way a tired person leans against a doorframe at the end of a long day, as though it had simply decided that standing fully upright required a conviction it no longer possessed. She pushed the gate open. The wire latch gave without protest. The yard was a ruin of dead grass and old stones. A path had once led from the gate to the front door, but the stones had shifted and sunk, and now they looked like crooked teeth in a green jaw. There was a well to the right, separate from the village well, capped with a wooden lid that had warped and split down the center. She could smell copper from it. Faintly. The same smell as the village well, but closer, more intimate, like the earth here had a particular taste it wanted you to know about. She walked the path. Her boots found the stones by memory, as though feet were meant to walk toward doors, regardless of whether the door deserved the visit. The front door was oak, or had been oak. Now it was oak and weather and neglect, swollen in its frame so that it stuck when she pushed it. She put her shoulder into it. The door gave with a sound like a man clearing his throat after a long silence. Inside, dust. Dust and the grey light of late afternoon coming through gaps in the shutters, in thin bright lines that cut the dark into slices. One room, large, with a hearth at the far wall. The hearth was stone, and it was the only thing in the house that looked like it meant to last. Everything else had softened. The floorboards had warped. The ceiling beams showed the work of beetles. A staircase along the left wall climbed to a loft that she could not yet see into, and did not yet trust to hold her weight. There was a table. One leg was shorter than the others, and someone had shimmed it with a folded piece of leather that had since gone hard and thin as a wafer. 2 chairs, one missing its back, a shelf on the wall with 3 clay jars, all empty, all dusty, all waiting with the particular patience of vessels that have forgotten what they were meant to hold. She stood in the center of the room and breathed. The air tasted of old wood and copper and something green. The vines. They had come through the walls in 2 places, curling across the interior stone like script in a language she could not read. Living things inside a dead space. Stubborn things. She opened her hand. The 5 coins sat in her palm. They had left round impressions in her skin, red and deep, almost like brands. She had held them so tightly and for so long that her hand ached when she uncurled her fingers. 5 gold for a life she did not choose to leave. 5 gold for a house that had forgotten how to stand straight. She closed her hand again. Not yet. She wanted to see the well first. The first wall she tried to fix nearly killed her. Not in any dramatic way. No collapse of timber, no roof caving in with a groan of ancient wood. Just Mora standing on a chair that had no business holding anyone's weight, reaching for a crack in the plaster above the kitchen door frame, and the whole thing buckling sideways beneath her. She hit the floor hip first, bit her tongue hard enough to taste copper, and lay there staring at the ceiling while dust settled on her face like snow. She got up, spat blood into the basin, found a better chair. That was the first day. The second day she pulled the blackthorn vines from the eastern wall and discovered that the vines had been the only thing holding 3 of the stones in place. They tumbled out like rotten teeth, and the wind came through the gap with a sound that was almost conversational, as though the house itself was sighing at her efforts. She gathered the stones, mixed mud and ash the way she half remembered her mother doing when she was small. Those enormous green hands working paste into the cracks of their old cottage, while Mora sat on the floor and handed her tools she didn't know the names of. The memory was imprecise, the feeling was not. She packed the mixture into the gaps and pressed the stones back and held them there until her arms shook and the pace began to set. It held. Barely. On the third day she addressed the roof. There were 2 places where the thatch had rotted through entirely, and a third where something had nested and torn a hole the size of her head. She didn't have proper thatching reed, so she cut long grass from the field behind the house and bundled it tight the way she'd seen farmers do, though she'd never done it herself, and the bundles looked more like the nests of a deranged bird than anything resembling craftsmanship. She climbed up anyway, laid them in, tied them down with strips torn from the hem of her old dress, which was already too short and too tight, and which she had stopped thinking of as clothing and started thinking of as raw material. Pell appeared on the 4th day. The gnome woman stood at the gate for a long time, watching Mora haul a warped board from the front step and try to plane it flat with a borrowed knife. Mora knew she was there. She could feel the watching the way she always could, that particular weight of someone's eyes, measuring and calculating and deciding what you were. She kept working. Eventually, Pell said, "You're holding the knife wrong." Mora adjusted her grip without looking up. Still wrong. Mora stopped, looked at her. The gnome's face was unreadable beneath its architecture of wrinkles, but her eyes were sharp and dark and not unkind. "Show me then," Mora said. Pell came through the gate. Her hands were small and knobbed with age, but they moved the knife across the wood with a sureness that made Mora's chest ache, because it was the sureness of someone who had done a thing 10,000 times and no longer needed to think about it. And Mora wanted that, wanted to be that certain about anything. "You'll wreck your knuckles gripping like that," Pell said, handing the knife back. "Orc hands are strong, but the joints were the same as anyone's. Your mother could have told you that." The words landed in a place Mora hadn't guarded. She took the knife, adjusted her grip the way Pell had shown her, went back to the board. They didn't speak again that afternoon. But Pell sat on the old stump by the gate and didn't leave. And when Mora finally got the board flat enough to fit back into the step, the gnome woman gave a single nod that contained no praise and no criticism, and somehow meant more than either. Mora worked until dark. She worked until her hands cramped and her shoulders burned, and the house looked no better from the road, but felt different from the inside, the way a body feels different after a fever breaks. Still weak, still damaged, but turned towards something. She slept on the floor again that night, wrapped in her cloak, and she did not dream of doors closing. She dreamed of walls holding. The well was the problem. Mora had known it from the first morning she'd hauled up a bucket and caught the copper tang before the water even cleared the rim. She drunk it anyway because thirst doesn't negotiate, but she'd watched the color settle in the wooden pail and thought about her mother's hands sorting river stones, teaching her which water sang clean and which water lied. This water lied. She spent 2 days pulling rocks from the well shaft, lowering herself on a rope she didn't entirely trust, scraping at the mineral deposits that had crusted along the inner wall like old scabs. The work was brutal and stupid and exactly the kind of thing that could kill a person quietly. A slipped knot, a loose stone, a fall into dark water with no one above to hear the splash. But on the second evening, she hauled up a bucket that smelled like nothing at all, and she drank it standing in the last copper light of the day, and it was the sweetest thing she had ever tasted. Pell appeared the next morning. She did not knock. She simply materialized at the gate with a clay pot in her arms, and an expression that suggested she had been watching the well work from a distance, and had opinions she had been generous enough to withhold until now. "You could have died in that shaft," Pell said. "Didn't. Luck is not a skill. Worked out the same, though." Pell set the clay pot on the fence post. It was full of something that smelled of garlic and fat and slow patience. Stew, Mora realized. Someone had made her stew. She didn't know what to do with her hands. "The well feeds 3 houses besides yours," Pell said, as though the stew required no acknowledgement. "Brannock's forge, my shop, and the Dunley cottage at the bend. That water's been off for 2 years. Brannock hauls from the creek. I collect rain. The Dunleys moved to Ashfen proper last winter, partly on account of it." Mora looked at the well. She looked at the pot of stew. The arithmetic was not complicated. "You're saying I fixed something that mattered." "I'm saying you fixed something that was broken, and people noticed." Pell adjusted her shawl with the careful dignity of someone who had been adjusting shawls for longer than most family lines had existed. "There's a difference. Mattering is what happens after." The blacksmith came that afternoon. Brannock was enormous in the way that years at a forge made a person enormous, and the empty sleeve pinned at his left shoulder did nothing to diminish the impression. He stood at her gate and looked at the well, and then looked at her roof, which she had mostly patched with salvaged slate and stubbornness. "Pell says the water's clean." "It is." He nodded slowly, the way large men nod when they are rearranging something in their heads. "I've got hinges. Good iron. Your door's hanging on rope and spite. I don't have coin for hinges. Didn't ask for coin." He rubbed the back of his neck with his one broad hand. "I'm asking if you'll let me hang them. There's a difference." That word again. Difference. As if the whole village spoke in the same quiet language of things offered sideways, so they couldn't be refused without rudeness. She let him hang the hinges. The door swung true for the first time since she'd moved in, closing with a sound that was less like a complaint and more like a sentence finished properly. Brannock tested it twice, grunted his approval, and left without ceremony. That night, Mora sat on her step and ate Pell's stew from the clay pot with a wooden spoon she'd carved herself. The door behind her was solid. The water in her cup was clean. Somewhere down the road, Brannock's hammer rang out its late rhythm against the cooling evening air. She was not welcome, not exactly. Welcome was a word for people who arrived with invitations and clean histories. But she was not unwelcome either, and for now, in this place that leaned and creaked and held itself together out of habit, that was more than enough. The morning after the last stone went back into the eastern wall, Mora woke to silence and did not immediately reach for a tool. She lay on the pallet she had built from salvaged timber and stuffed with dried bracken, staring at the ceiling she had rethatched with her own hands, and she listened. Wind pressed against the walls, and the walls did not groan. Rain had come twice in the night, hard and sudden, and the floor beneath her was dry. The door sat square in its frame. The shutters held. She breathed. Something had shifted. Not in the house. In her. For weeks the work had been a kind of running. Every cracked beam she braced, every collapsed section she cleared and rebuilt, had been motion for the sake of motion. Her hands busy so her mind could not wander back to a closed door and a quiet voice saying words that meant goodbye. She had poured herself into the labor the way water pours into a crack in stone, filling every gap, pressing into every hollow, because if she stopped, she would have to sit with the shape of what had happened to her, and she was not ready for that. But the house was standing now. Not perfect, not finished, but standing. And so was she. Mora rose and pulled on her boots, lacing them with the new cord Pell had given her in exchange for splitting a week's worth of firewood. She stepped outside into the grey dawn and looked at what she had made. The blackthorn vines she had not fully cut back. She had trimmed them away from the windows and the door, cleared them from the foundation stones where their roots had been working slow damage, but she had left them along the southern wall where they climbed in thick dark braids toward the roofline. They would flower in spring, Pell had told her. Small white blossoms, sharp-scented, good for tinctures and tea. So she let them stay. The house wore them like something between armor and decoration, and Mora liked that. She understood that. Grug had come by the previous evening. He had stood at the gate with his one arm tucked against his side and his heavy brow furrowed, and he had looked at the house for a long time without speaking. Then he had nodded once, the way he did, which from Grug meant more than most people's speeches. He had left a bundle on the gatepost. Inside she found a hand-forged door latch, black iron, simple and heavy and well made. She had fitted it that night by firelight and tested it 3 times, and each time it caught and held, with a sound like a lock finding home. Now she stood in her doorway with her hand on that latch, and she thought about what came next. 5 gold coins. That was what she had walked in with. The 5 gold were gone now, swallowed by the house and the land it sat on. And she had nothing left but what she could do with her hands and her back and whatever stubbornness had carried her this far. She would need work, real work, not just barter and odd jobs. She would need seed for the garden plot she had cleared behind the house. She would need to prove to Thornwick that she was not passing through, that she had weight, that she intended to stay. She would need to become someone this place could not do without. The thought did not frighten her. It sat in her chest like a coal that had finally caught, small and hot and steady. She closed the door behind her. The latch held. She walked down the single road of Thornwick toward the well, where the day's work would find her, or she would find it. And the house stood behind her, in the early light, solid and imperfect, and hers. Not a refuge, not a hiding place. A beginning. The first frost came on a morning so still that Mora heard it happening. a faint crystalline whisper across the thatch she'd patched 3 times now. Across the garden beds she'd lined with river stone. Across the well-cover Brannock had helped her build from salvaged oak. She lay in bed and listened to the world go quiet and hard and new. She rose before the sun. Habit now, not survival. She pulled on the heavy wool shirt she'd traded Pell 2 jars of blackthorn salve for, and pushed her feet into boots that were finally wearing to the shape of her stride, rather than someone else's memory. The fire in the hearth caught on the second strike. She'd learned the trick of banking coals through the night, a lesson her mother must have known, but never had the chance to teach her. The house did not lean anymore. She'd fixed that in the 7th week, after Brannock showed her how to brace the foundation stones with timber cut at angles she hadn't known had names. It had taken 4 days. Her shoulders had ached so deeply she'd slept on the floor, because climbing into the bed frame felt like an act of war against her own body. But she'd done it. And now the walls stood true, and the door frame no longer whistled in the wind, and when she set a cup of water on the table, it stayed where she put it. Such a small thing. A cup that doesn't slide. She thought about it more than she should. Outside, the frost had turned the blackthorn vines silver. They'd crept back twice since she cut them, and she'd let them stay along the fence line, because Pell said the berries would come in late autumn, and they had. Small and dark and so tart they made her eyes water, but good in the tea she brewed each morning, and better in the jam she was slowly learning not to burn. She walked the garden, kale still standing, turnips bedded down beneath straw. The rosemary had gone woody, but it would survive. She knew this the way she was beginning to know many things about this piece of ground, not from books or lessons, but from watching and failing and watching again. The soil here was thin and rocky, and it did not give easily. She respected that about it. Smoke rose from Brannock's forge by the time she reached the well. She could hear the uneven rhythm of his hammer, that particular music of a man who had learned to do with one arm what most couldn't manage with 2. He didn't wave. He never did while working. But he'd left a bundle of prior nails on her gatepost, still warm, with a strip of leather tied around them, and no note, because Brannock did not waste words on things that didn't need them. She drew water. The copper smell was almost gone now. She'd spent 2 days scrubbing the stone lining with sand and vinegar on Pell's instruction, and the old gnome had stood at the rim watching with her arms crossed and her mouth puckered, and had finally said, "Not bad," which Mora had learned was the highest praise available in Thornwick. She carried the bucket back to her house. Her house. She said it sometimes just to feel the shape of it. Not Aldrich's house. Not a borrowed room or a space made reluctantly available. Hers. Paid for with 5 gold coins that a man had pressed into her hand because he could not press anything else. Not courage, not conviction. Just gold and a closed door. She set the bucket on the table, and it did not slide. Mora stood in her kitchen with frost on her boots and cold air in her lungs and the sound of a one-armed blacksmith building something useful carried on the wind. She thought about roads, how they go 2 directions always, how the one that brought her here started with a door closing and ended with her choosing to stop walking. She hadn't written to her father. Maybe she would. Maybe she wouldn't. But she would stay. She put the kettle on.